So welcome to Virtual Office Hour number 100. We started these during COVID to help people stay informed about COVID transmission and what we can do, particularly with regard to transmission through food safety, through food products, and here we are. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's panelists, which are Madhu Anand from the New York State Department of Health, Alejandro Mazzotta from Chobani, and Melanie Newman from Newman Advisory Services, also an entrepreneur at residence at Cornell. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what happens during a foodborne outbreak investigation. And my initial presentation will focus more on a food industry perspective, but we specifically invited Madhu to then also answer questions regarding, how does that look from the public health side, from a state health department side, because when we looked at the attendee list, we saw that a lot of attendees from state and local health departments, so we want to make sure we answer your questions too. As always, slides are available. Let Alex know or me know if you want the slides, if you want to use them. Recording will be made available, and type in your questions in the chat. If we don't get any there, we'll use some of the questions that were pre-submitted. So what are we going to cover today? We're going to start out with just a high-level overview on surveillance and outbreak detection, and then dig into a little bit deeper what happens in these interactions between CDC and FDA and the company. We've talked a lot about whole genome sequencing in some of these office hours before, so this is not going to be focused on whole genome sequencing, but I just want to make sure I emphasize that, many of the drivers of outbreak investigations and these interactions, have a lot to do with whole genome sequencing. If you're interested in sort of upping your knowledge on that, again, let Alex know, let me know, and we have office hours that are recorded and other resources to help bring you up to speed. But with whole genome sequencing, obviously, the number of detected outbreaks have increased. These are these yellow bars in this picture that you see on the right side. So, being prepared for food industry, to be implicated as a potential source of an outbreak and how to address that has become more important now than it has ever been. So let's talk about, how does a company get implicated in an outbreak? How is an outbreak detected? There's what's been termed sort of the traditional route that starts with a cluster of illnesses, goes through epidemiology, potentially trace back, and then confirms a link between illnesses and the food, and then typically identifies a food company or a food product that is the source. So let's walk through it in a little bit more detail. So typically it starts with having 2 or more human clinical cases. Typically it's rarely 2, usually talking 4 or 5, where these people test positive for a foodborne pathogen, let's say salmonella, when a fecal sample is collected, or maybe listeria if a blood sample is collected. And whole genome sequencing, which we're really going to call DNA fingerprinting, shows that these 2 isolates or 3 isolates are identical or closely related, and therefore it is likely that these humans were infected from the same source. Typically also is a temporal piece to it. So, we have 2 or 3 or more humans, same subtype over 2, 3, 4 months, but this subtemporal window might be longer, particularly for listeria, and suggesting that there's an outbreak. But at this point, we don't call it an outbreak, we call it a cluster. And we investigate a cluster to determine whether it actually is an outbreak, meaning linked to a common source. And this is what this would look like when we look at the actual data behind the scenes. So this is a family tree from whole genome sequencing. And what you see here is you see a number of clinical isolates in this publicly accessible database on top. And you see that most of them were collected over a very short time frame, some from June 29 of 2023 through July 13. So this is a classic, cluster. I'm going to say, what's going on here? We got this many people infected with the same fingerprint or closely related fingerprints of Listeria monocytogenes or salmonella. So then the next step would be an epidemiological investigation. This is where you identify patterns where and when people got sick, interview sick people to find a common thread, such as a common food consumed, and potentially even discover clusters of people that, ate at the same restaurant, ate at the same grocery store, etc. And this is what, if you take some published papers, this is what this practically looks like. So let's take the one on top left, where we see identified 31 cases from 4 states. We describe the temporal pattern, so happened from June 10 to August 13, so relative narrow time frame. But then in highlight yellow is the epidemiological investigation. 26 of 27 people reported eating leafy greens, and 14 of the 22 people named Farm A products. All right. So suggesting pretty strongly that it is leafy greens. Now, some might argue that, hey, in a few days before onset of illness, many people will eat leafy greens because it's a commonly consumed product, but 96% is high. And as Madhu will tell us later on, you can use statistical techniques saying, is that a significant association? This one probably will be. And so we have identified first a vehicle, likely vehicle, leafy greens, but then we also have a likely source, which is Farm A products. And that will be the epidemiological investigation. Another example, larger outbreak, 380 ill people on the right side. 305 of these 380 people were interviewed. 90% said eating onions 7 days before they got sick. 78 reported tomatoes and so on. So then onions is really on the top of the list. And that then identifies very specific types of products. And here's also the results from the statistical analysis. So tomato, cilantro, and leafy green, significantly more frequent reported among the ill people. So here it's not quite as clear. We don't have one product, but we have multiple products that may then have to be further investigated. So this is sort of what I would call some of the typical epi investigations that start this. Now, sometimes if you have very strong epidemiology, that might be enough to say, hey, we are very sure that this outbreak is caused by X company, and we, FDA will request a recall, or even, which they could, require a recall of that product. That's not unusual, but often very confusing to companies, and we will get into that later. And typically, the epi evidence needs to be very strong for this to happen. We got 10 sick people with the same subtype. 10 of 10 said they ate cheese A, and that cheese A is made by a very small cheesemaker. So it's very, very unlikely that all of them just ate that same cheese by chance. After the epidemiological, sometimes concurrently, we have a traceback investigation, okay? And that's trying to determine the common source of contamination. Sometimes, we might link multiple cases to a certain restaurant or to 2 or 3 restaurants, but the real source might be upstream, might be a processing facility, it might even be a field where produce is grown. Some typical strategies used for traceback investigations is where people actually go back to what's called point of service, which is essentially where people got served their food. And so for example, here we have talk about a traceback investigation. They identified 7 points of services. So you had a large outbreak. You had multiple people that got sick and converged at 7 different establishments, let's call it. And then for 6 of the 7 of these, the products, in this case, I think it was leafy greens, came from one distribution center. So we can now drive it to one distribution center and say, what's common about this distribution center? And then we go back further. So we could have, different example, but we have a steakhouse, it goes to a distribution center, it goes to fresh processing, it goes to some farms, and then goes to ranches where produce is grown. So we can trace this back potentially all the way to a specific field if we're talking about produce and some of these products. Now, we all see that this is not typically the real world. This might happen with a very small outbreak. When we look at some of the real world outbreaks, it looks much more complicated like this typically. Multiple points of services. You can see the meal dates, how many cases, bunch of different distributors, goes from one distributor to another, to yet to another, to a grower, then uses multiple fields. But it looks like most of these cases here have a potential link to grower A. So this will be a much more complicated traceback analysis. So Sometimes when this epi combines with the traceback, that might be enough to request a recall. Let's say the epi is strong, but not deemed strong enough to request a recall. But in the traceback, we are very clear, it appears very clear that it impacts one specific facility, that the product that's common to these people likely came from that processing facility. That might be enough for a recall. And note that in both cases, we're not talking about any positive result for a pathogen from a food or a facility. This is solely based on sort of epidemiological and traceback evidence. But that can be strong enough to implicate a certain food and company as the source of an outbreak. Now, the third thing that can happen is food and environmental testing. Typically occurs after often occurs after an initial recall, but it might be when we have suspected foods and want to find out which it is. Let's say we do epi, we do traceback, and we're like, it could be the tomatoes, it could be the onions. We are really not sure with those data. We can't figure it out. Then concurrent or after this investigation, state health departments, ag and markets, FDA might start to test products, might start to test tomatoes and onions, might start to test tomatoes from different facilities to see whether they can find a product that tests positive for what we call the outbreak strain and therefore provides a better indication where an outbreak may have come from. So where would these food samples be collected? Sometimes they're collected from consumer homes. Sometimes it could be someone said, I ate this product and I have some leftovers, or sometimes they say about 2 packets of hot dogs and we ate one of them and the other one I still have in the freezer. Real story. And then that package from freezers might be collected and tested. Sometimes collection might happen at retailers. You have 2 people say, well, we bought our product that is linked to this outbreak at retailer A in this city. Someone might go out and collect samples there. Sometimes it's distribution centers, sometimes it's processing plants and packing houses. If you're a food manufacturer and foods are collected in consumer homes, you wouldn't know necessarily. That could happen, and you have no idea that these foods are being tested and they're just suspected as the source of an outbreak. When these samples are collected, they might yield a pathogen, so a Salmonella or Listeria, that by whole genome sequencing matches this isolates from patients. And that's what people often call this smoking gun. Like, we have a cluster, we identified a common source, it's tomatoes, we traced it back to farm A, we tested tomatoes from farm A, they tested positive for the same strain. That's a pretty strong evidence that a specific product is the source of an outbreak. It is not 100% proof. In some cases, there could be other transmission pathways, but it's the strongest evidence. However, in some more cases, and it's not too infrequent, this food testing might not yield a pathogen strain, or it might yield a pathogen, just a different strain than the one involved in the outbreak, which, if it's food testing, suggests there's a problem, but might not support that this company or this product is this actual source of the outbreak. Environmental testing follows a similar pattern, but typically there we might go back to a company that's a likely source. I'd say tomato processor A seems to be a likely source. Let's go into that facility and collect samples from the environment. Sometimes it involves going back to farms where soil and or water samples might be collected. Sometimes for smaller outbreaks, it might be involve going back to a restaurant and collecting environmental samples as a restaurant, because we may suspect that cleaning practices in this restaurant were not strong enough and salmonella survived for days or weeks in a restaurant, contaminated product, and made people sick over time. So that can happen in different locations of the environment. Same story, you might find the pathogen that matches, you might not. The strength of what that means depends on the specific situation. The other type of investigation is what we can be called sampled initiated retrospective outbreak investigation or outbreak detection. So what does that mean? That starts with a non-human isolate in the database. Sometimes people call these historical isolates. And that could be an isolate from a food product, a processing facility that was obtained in the past, or maybe obtained very recently. So, practical scenario, FDA visits a processing plant, collects some finished product samples, one tests positive for salmonella, and it is added to the database, to the whole genome sequencing database or the NCBI database, whatever you want to call it. And once it's in this database, it turns out there are 2 or more human isolates that actually happen to match this food isolate. Now, that doesn't mean that that food caused these human cases, but it raises a suspicion that starts further investigation. Often that might mean going back to the case patients, so the patients were infected with this subtype and interviewing them. And sometimes it might be just going back to the data and seeing if the interview data are there to review them to see whether they're consistent with a certain exposure. And this is what this sort of practically would look like. You have a database and you have multiple environmental isolates in there. Let's say you have avocado, you have potatoes in there. And these ones typically are not potatoes from Mexico. They're actually potatoes that were tested in Mexico. But then you have closely related clinical isolates. So that raises a suspicion, could these clinical isolates be related to potato consumption? And then we might interview these people. This is an example where there actually was not an outbreak ultimately, but it illustrates the type of investigation that starts with environmental samples. So what happens when CDC or FDA call a company to implicate them as the source of an outbreak? So far we sort of covered how do you get there. We're going to spend a little bit of time now. What is this interaction between regulatory and public health agencies and industry? There's what I call the call. And that's where typically what happens is that companies get anywhere from 12 hours to 2 days warning that FDA and CDC want to talk to them. In some cases, that might be a total surprise. In some cases, they may have some prior calls and interactions where CDC or FDA may have said, we're looking at an outbreak. Some people mentioned your product. Can you give us some more information? Typically, when this happens and we're talking about an outbreak, FDA and CDC may provide some materials up front or may simply start sharing materials as the call evolves. This typically includes a slide set on some info on epidemiology. That's the type of information I showed you earlier. May include some information on traceback. Essentially, almost always includes some information on whole genome sequence data, which typically involve pretty highly technical sounding explanations, SNP differences, pipelines used that are very elusive to the average person in a food company. Typically, it includes a large number of people from CDC and FDA, followed by some introductions, review of the data, and then typically a pronouncement of a public health concern that we are worried that your product is causing this outbreak and that we're planning to make an announcement within 12 to 24 hours informing the public, and that it probably is a really good idea for you to do a recall now and sooner rather than later. When this happens, sometimes the word insanitary conditions is mentioned, that we have some concerns about insanitary conditions in your facility. That might be if close related subtypes were found multiple times over weeks, months, or years, suggesting that Listeria or Salmonella persisted in a certain environment, which is sort of an indication that the agency or CDC might be interested in you making a recall that doesn't just cover 1 or 2 products, but covers large numbers of products produced in the facility. Sometimes when these calls happen is that CDC and FDA isn't quite sure yet as to who caused the outbreak. So that happens too. And so this would be a situation like the one described here, where you have an ongoing outbreak investigation and there are different types of companies potentially involved. This guy was a cantaloupe outbreak, where the expectation is that all companies get calls. US FDA is going to continue to do sampling. And in this case, you can see multiple companies issued recalls. So sometimes there's a focus on one company. Sometimes it might be early in the investigation stage where multiple companies are implicated. And sometimes it could be simply because multiple companies received raw products or agricultural products from a single supplier, a single farm where the contamination event could have happened. So there can be a lot of complexities in this stage, depending on what type of product and what type of outbreak we're talking about. Now, here's my experience, what typically happens when industry gets these, what I call the call. And they go to the classical cycles of grief. The first, deny it, that can't be us. They're angry, they're typically angry at the agency, at CDC and FDA, just trying to bargain. Well, let's just have a small recall. Well, what if we don't have a recall and you just do some more testing until you find it, etc. And then we move into depression and acceptance. And it truly is that companies go through these cycles. Frequent responses, as I said, the start off is denial. Can't be us. Oh, you don't have a positive in our product, therefore it can't be us. Typically on these calls, you see further denial. Like we've been in business for 120 years. We never had any problems. And then, some of the other things that I already mentioned. Interesting, I was wondering, we had a lot of people sign up for this office hours, and I feel like we're just going through sort of stage one, the denial stage. I have gone with a recent outbreak linked to raw cheddar, and this is some information or some snippets I grabbed from some web pages where the raw farm company is like, puts out, I'm going to call it propaganda, why not? No evidence found, bias from FDA, CDC, against farm, unfounded recall. It's now lifted, but it wasn't really lifted. The company just sort of didn't like it. No evidence to support raw cheese recall, and that's because no one found product and no one had reported a positive in our product, etc. So this is the classical denial stage. Some companies get through it pretty quickly, some of them not so much. And what I find intriguing, and as a sidebar, and this sort of was discussed at some point, the recall the company started to recall. Bill Marler claims that he did it because he's said, if someone buys the product after FDA's advisory comes out and gets sick, creates a more difficult legal problem for the company. That's why companies recall. Yeah, I'm not sure Bill was responsible for that recall, but hey. So based on this, how should companies respond when this happens or when they get involved at this level? I think the key part is before they call, assemble the right team. I think there often is a tendency to just bring your food safety people on there and hope it will blow over. It almost never does. So get everyone on that team. That's your president, your CEO, your legal team. It's sometimes an outside lawyer, food safety experts that can help you interpret some of this highly technical data. Start to collect as much internal information up front as you can. Make sure you understand the basics of whole genome sequencing and epidemiology. So you don't spend too much time on asking technical questions, but understand how an outbreak investigation is done, etc. That's sort of the prep. And I understand that can be very challenging because you're given very little notice. Then the key to me is to very quickly move through these initial responses and start to move to the planning and proactive behavior. How you react and what you do in these first hours after an outbreak is linked to you or potentially linked to a company is really, really important. So what should you be doing on the call? Collect information and get details. If you feel like FDA or whoever's in the phone has information that's not correct or that doesn't fit, provide clarification, push back on certain facts. So what could be issues? If you have an outbreak where the cases occur in 3 states, but your products are shipped to different states. Like, hey, you got cases in New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont, but our product is only shipped to Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Well, this might not be your outbreak. Something weird is going on, right? And so on. Another important one is market share, right? Sometimes people say, well, out of 6 people that were sick, 3 of them said they ate your product, and you're like, yeah, well, 50% of salad in the US is produced by us. 50% of yogurt in the US is produced by us. 50% of whatever smoked pork tongue is produced by us. So that doesn't mean it's us. So market share is something sometimes regulatory agencies do not fully understand. Understand what FDA and CDC will do. Are they going to make an announcement? How quickly are they going to make an announcement? At this point, ideally you start to offer actions you will take or at least consider, saying, okay, based on the information we've given us, we're going to review them, but we plan to do this, this, and that, and we will get back to you within a certain time frame. The key part overall for this call is to get enough information to make some of those decisions. Like, how big a recall am I going to make? Am I going to recall only a specific type of product? Like, am I only going to recall tomatoes that came through my plant on June 1? Am I going to recall all tomatoes? Am I going to recall tomatoes and peppers? How big a recall am I going to have? What evidence is there that helps me to understand how much I need to recall? Does the outbreak investigation indicate it was tomatoes, but there were also peppers involved? Or is there no indication of pepper consumption? Some of those questions are going to be very, very important because the company typically has to make the initial call as to how big a recall they will issue. Some words of caution for industry. I think FDA very rarely after this call say, oops, sorry, we were wrong. We thought it was you, but it isn't. Okay. It doesn't mean they don't use the information to refine their hypothesis, to refine how big they think a recall should be. But trying to push back is important. But I think the more important thing is to also collect the information to execute the right recall and take the correct actions. This can be very stressful. You got 20 people on the call from regulatory agencies, and they may tell you, well, no matter what you tell us here, we're going to have a press release in 12 hours that say we had 20 people sick because of product produced by your company. Focus should be on what one might call damage control, determine whether a recall is needed, what is the scope of the recall, get the information that can help you with a root cause analysis. Does the information suggest it happened in your facility versus a raw material? Understand the FDA timelines. Understand what else CDC and FDA are doing. Are they still sampling? Are they still testing samples? Do they have samples that are being tested right now? So, for example, you might get a call that says, we found product with a production date of June 1 positive for salmonella, and you might conclude that you only need to recall June 1. Now, if they also have product that they're testing from May 29 and June 3, the test results aren't going to come out until a day. You need to know that, and you probably might proactively recall these lots too. So those can be some key questions to ask. Recall scope, identifying the recall scope becomes very important. The natural inclination for companies tends to be to keep the recall small. 1 day of production, 1 production lot. And in many cases where that's done, particularly if it's an outbreak, we have what people call a rolling recall. If we first recall product produced on 1 day, then we recall the same product in a 1-week window, then we recall all of the product, then we recall everything we make, and then we shut down our plant. So that means you're in the news 4 times, and it becomes a continuous problem versus just executing a larger recall once and being done with it. These are tough decisions, but try to get as much information as needed to help you make those decisions correct. So that's sort of what I call sort of, the anatomy of an outbreak investigation. Um, Not every call from CDC and FDA is about something that's linked to your facility. Okay. And I think that's important for people to also understand. Sometimes it's information gathering early on in an outbreak. Sometimes agencies might simply be interested in specific information about a supply chain. Um, Once you have a call from FDA and CDC, however, bring in people, say, hey, we got a call from FDA, CDC. They say they're investigating an outbreak on tomatoes, and 2 out of 10 people mentioned our name. What should we do? Because often this is an early warning that a more in-depth call will come later. If you're part of a trade organization, contact your trade organizations, etc. Now, there's also a lesson or a potential value for state health departments or even smaller health departments. Sometimes it makes sense to contact industry experts early on and find out information about a supply chain. Let's say you investigate a small outbreak linked to tomatoes and you're trying to figure out, well, where do tomatoes come from this time of the year? Contact the extension people in a university. Contact the centers of excellence, which Madhu will talk about later. Get some more information on supply chains to help with outbreak investigations and trace back. Now I'm going to spend the last couple of minutes in just talking about how do you prepare for this, and maybe more importantly, how do you prevent being on the wrong side of a cluster and an outbreak investigation. Prevention is key, right? If you're an industry, review your food safety plans. Make sure you have a strong environmental monitoring program. If there's ever been any history of a pathogen positive linked to a facility you own, to a product you produce, make sure you know that and monitor the whole genome sequence database to see when or if human isolates are added that match an old isolate. In plain language, what do I mean? If you own a facility where 10 years ago FDA found listeria, that listeria is in the DNA fingerprint database. You can find it, like here. So let's say this is your company. It's a company in Canada that makes bacon and cheese pastry. There were 2 isolates collected in July of 2018. You can, in this database, set up a watch for these 2 isolates. And if a clinical isolate is added that is close related to those two, today, tomorrow, or whenever, you will get an email that will tell you that. And that means you probably should start to get prepared for a call, and you should start to reevaluate your practices even more than you usually would do. And it really comes like this. And I've set up some of these. So you get a new E. coli, new Listeria isolate notification for a watched isolate. If you're interested in setting that up, again, contact us. Pretty sure we even have a webinar recorded that walks through this. Okay. What else? I've walked you through what an outbreak looks like. Do a fake outbreak investigation. Do a mock outbreak investigation. We're not talking about a product traceback. We're not talking about a fake recall. We're talking about pretending an outbreak is linked to your facility. Pray through the whole issue. Assess what the cost would be. Assess how good you are at responding to this and improve your systems. Have a plan, maybe even have an SOP. Understand who you would call if an issue like that comes up. Who do you want to have on their phone on this first call with CDC and FDA? Plan through this as much as you can. Melanie and I have both done these mock outbreak investigations, and in an extreme, one of us and other people do that too, might show up at one company's site, knock on the door, and have a letter from the CEO saying, you are to pretend that this is a real outbreak, and there's a scenario that we play out to see how well you react to that. At the end of this, you will understand your weaknesses and have a better plan going forward. There's a preparedness on the level of what I'm going to call mindset. Assume that a recall will happen to you. Maybe even assume that a small outbreak will happen to you. Have a strategy to minimize the scope and impact of a recall. This is different than what most people will do. Many people say, we just want to make sure we don't have a recall. I tend to help companies think through, what if you have a recall? How can you keep it small? How can you keep it small enough that your business will survive without lasting financial and other repercussions? And that often means, how do you make sure you have the data that, one day's production, if it was contaminated with salmonella, it doesn't carry over to the next day? How do you have validated clean break? Do you have traceabilities? Do you have all the records? And whatever else your mock outbreak investigation tells you you need, so that when something like this happens, you can have a very small recall and stick with it, whether it's a day or a week. So in summary, outbreaks today are probably more likely to be detected than before, and they're more likely linked to specific products, and that's whole genome sequencing. Costs are substantial. I think it is very important to prepare for the worst, but focus on prevention. So prepare for the worst is like, what do you do if you're implicated? But try to do whatever you can to prevent being a source of an outbreak, being implicated in a recall or required to do a recall. But if you do, make sure you can limit the recall and scope of your recall and other issues. So that's what I had in terms of sort of an overview. And so what I'm going to do is stop sharing my screen. And we're going to move into the questions. So I've not seen any questions added to the chat. So once again, if you have questions, add them to the chat. If you want to speak up, it's also perfectly fine to just unmute yourself and say, hey, I have a question. So